Welcome. I'm Luis Jaramillo, the director of the School of Writing at the New School. I'm so pleased to welcome back our friends from Cave Canem. For over 15 years, we at the New School have been honored to program events with Cave Canem, and the Poets on Craft events are my favorite. The readings are moving, funny, and political, and the conversations deal with craft in a very broad way. The poets don't just talk about form or how to write a line, they also talk about how to be a writer in this messy world, and this is very important, how to be a writer of color in this world. Tonight we have with us Sandra Lim and Frank X. Walker reading, and they'll be joined in conversation with Saretta Morgan. I'd also like to thank some people tonight. Thank you, Alison Myers, for all of the work that you do and for bringing Cave Canem here. Thank you, Gregory Collins, Dimitri Raftopoulos, and Paul Flores. And I'd also like to invite you to join us again on Thursday. We're having an event celebrating, this is the 100th year of the birth of James Baldwin, 90th year. James Baldwin was actually a student at the New School, so he's very close to our, our DNA or something. But the kind of writing that he does is the kind of writing that we love, the very intelligent, beautifully crafted, plus there's that punch at the end too. So that's with Daryl Pickney, Dante Michaud, and the conversation will be moderated by Tracy Ann Williams. Now I have the pleasure of introducing Nicole Seeley, who will give the proper introductions. Nicole is a Cave Canem Graduate Fellow, as well as the recipient of a 2014 Elizabeth George Foundation grant. She is the author of The Animal After Whom Other Animals Are Named, winner of the 2015 Drinking Gourd Chapbook Prize, forthcoming from Northwestern University Press. Congratulations, Nicole. Her other honors include the 2014 Stanley Kunitz Memorial Prize from the American Poetry Review, a 2013 Daniel Verugin Award, and the 2012 Poetry International Prize. Her work has appeared in Best New Poets 2011, Coppernickel, Plowshares, Third Coast, and elsewhere. Nicole holds an MLA in Africana Studies from the University of South Florida and an MFA in Creative Writing from New York University. She is the Programs Director at Cave Canem Foundation. Please welcome Nicole Seeley to the podium.
Good evening and welcome. Again, I'm Nicole Seeley, Programs Director at Cave Canem, a national organization dedicated to cultivating the artistic and professional growth of African American poets. For more information about Cave Canem, please visit cavecanempoets.org. Please sign our mailing list to receive updates as well as find out about our upcoming programs. We have exciting programs this spring, including the James Baldwin panel that Luis mentioned earlier. Check out our back table where you can buy the author's books as well as Cave Canem t-shirts. I'd like to thank our generous hosts, the New School, especially Lori Lynn Turner and Luis Jaramillo. Thank you so much. Thanks also to our funders, Mrs. Giles Whiting Foundation, the New York State Council on the Arts, and the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. And of course, all of you for coming out. It's my pleasure to introduce both Sandra Lim and Frank X. Walker. Sandra Lim is the author of The Wilderness, selected by Louise Glick for the Bernard Women Poets Prize, and a previous collection of poetry, Loveliest Grotesque. A Pushcart Prize winner, she has received fellowships from the MacDowell Colony, the Vermont Studio Center, and the Getty Research Institute. She is an assistant professor of English at the University of Massachusetts Lowell and lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Kentucky Poet Laureate Frank X. Walker is a professor in the Department of English at the University of Kentucky and the founding editor of Pluck, the Journal of Affrilachian Arts and Culture, a Cave Canem Fellow and co-founder of the Affrilachian Poets. He is the author of 6 collections of poetry, including Turn Me Loose, The Unghosting of Medgar Evers, winner of the 2014 NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Poetry. A Lannan Fellowship recipient, Walker has degrees from the University of Kentucky and Spalding University, as well as 2 honorary doctorates. Sandra and Frank will each read their work. Following their readings, poet Saretta Morgan, MFA candidate at Pratt Institute, will moderate a conversation between them. Please welcome Sandra Lim, who will be followed by Frank X. Walker.
Thank you, Nicole. Can everyone hear me? Thank you all for coming. I'm really pleased to be here tonight. Thank you, Cave Canem, and thank you, the New School, for sponsoring us, and Frank X. Walker. I'm excited to read with you. I'm going to read pretty much exclusively from the wilderness tonight, and I thought I'd start with a poem that, for me, sort of encompasses the questions that I seem to be asking in this volume. This is called Amor Fati, or Love of Fate. Inside every world, there is another world trying to get out. And there is something in you that would like to discount this world. The stars could rise in darkness over heartbreaking coasts, and you would not know if you were ruining your life or beginning a real one. You could claim professional fondness for the world around you. The pictures would dissolve under the paint coming alive, and you would only feel a phantom skip of the heart, absorbed so in the colors. Your disbelief is a later novel, emerging in the long, long shadow of an earlier one. Is this the great world, which is whatever is the case? The sustained helplessness you feel in the long emptiness of days is matched by the new suspiciousness and wrath you wake to each morning. Isn't this a relationship with your death too, to fall in love with your inscrutable life? Your teeth fill with cavities. There is always unearned happiness for some, and the criminal feeling of solitude. Always everyone lies about his life. When I was putting together this book, or writing the poems that comprise the collection, I was having a hard time finding exactly the right form for particular poems. And so I have a grouping of poems in here which they sort of have a sentence-like a prose structure, or that's the line, and they ask the reader or the listener to make, I think, kind of big associative leaps between the stanzas. So I think of the silences now in retrospect, or the gaps between the stanzas, as something that really, or my hope is, something that is asking you to find something there in those gaps, something available to your consciousness that maybe wasn't there before. So the next couple of poems come out of that structure. This one is called The Vanishing World. It's said that people tend to believe God believes what they believe. When I was young, I loved to get up before every dawn of the world, still sweetly baffled by the possibility of unbelief. Perhaps grace is not so poor a thing that it can't also appear in this instance like a new definition of luck, akin to tiny blossoms out of cactus thorns in spring, their loneliness crushing your lungs. Isn't everything sloughed from the same star? What is believable and possible? What is acceptable and what is nothing? Caught between the old and new year, why do you think that the old will be famous for its pain, the new from the liberation from pain? Some kind of belief still runs off me in strings. To enjoy the clarifying effect of participation without remainder may be the most mysterious thing. When I come to the right place, I believe I'll paint a door on it and walk right through. The Dark World. Pierre looks out the prison window and laughs because the world is inside him. I'm terrified because I love the world, but which one? It snows all afternoon, but in the west, the canyons are cooling in the shifting natural light. Each world curls at its edges, and yet I am ever biddable in either direction. Here is the interior holding up its torn roots in front of your eyes, seigneurial and glittering. I taste it slowly, the afternoon being as wide as a death. I hear the wind and the snow in the wind. I'm half open and half shut, dragging the chains of the day through the fat blood of a life, listening to the mathematics of one season drifting over to another. I want bars again, restaurants that stay open late, gossip in the kitchen. The bright tessellations of painful wishing, movies, plumes of envy, flower stalls. Let me stay awake as whole worlds keep arriving with their raggedness, with their synoptic force. Snowdrops. Spring comes forward as a late winter confection, and I cannot decide if it advances a philosophy of meekness or daring. This year's snowdrops, is it that they are spare and have a slightly fraught lucidity, or are they proof that pain too can be ornate? Even a propped skull is human nature, and its humor is monstrous, rich with an existence that owes nothing to anyone. Fat little pearls against the ice, battering softly. Try even fewer qualities. To say that you love someone or something to death is to hover around the draw of irrevocability. But more faith is asked of us, a trained imagination against the ice white. And then the last of these world poems, this is called The New World. The world we see never is the world that is. The senseless morning light cuts its white eyes open. What is the lecture of the darkest pines, the way they hang their stillness against us? If I beggar myself for love, do I move from night into more night? If I swallow a mouthful of ground glass, do I not slip past languages? Thunderous wakefulness is ceaseless needles through the casing. There are only the living and the dead, roses climbing a battered trellis. A caterpillar turns its hard black goggles upon the cold meat of me. Drinking wholly from the world remains dark argument, hardly moral. To be living in the feast sweetens my idea of death, its foreknowledge and its art. Affliction, make yourself a scar upon my house and count the ways. One of the epigraphs for my book is a Jewish Dutch proverb. I can't remember where I found it, but I loved it when I saw it. It says, "The greater the spirit, the greater the beast." And the next few poems I'm going to read, I always think of that particular epigraph for these sort of hovering over these poems. One way I narrate it to myself is that I think in these poems I'm getting to the spirit or sort of the hard spiritual questions or translating some of the fierceness or terror of the world that the characters or the voices are feeling inside these poems, but how those things get translated actually through what might be called things that are very anecdotal or demotic or very ordinary and everyday. This poem is called Human Interest Story. Snow would have been breaking the drifts that day, on a mild mood. My father was boarding at the home of a missionary couple in Seoul, getting by on books and the radio and cheap noodles. His older brother hanged himself that winter in Busan. They would say afterward that it was a plain death, funded by bad numbers, some selfishness, unusual cold. Think of a needle dropped into the sea. He had a pleasantly objective feeling about himself that morning, as the early sky gently ripped into red. He thought about business English, the truth of money. Across town, a diary opened, and there were the white, cooling coals in barrels. There was a pretty young wife and one serious boy and one very quiet girl. They awakened one day to a new planet where the spaces between people appeared slightly widened. Maybe you can't penetrate events with reportage, but facts have a sly, unanswerable texture that appears social. To relieve ourselves of open-ended narrative, we read into the winter stars all evening. There are just stars and stars and stars. We know what it's like to fall in love and be disassembled, but we still want to pull death right off the bodies of one another. These were spectacular nights, said my father. They were full of philosophy and political theory, noisy reversals, French movies. The romantic grace we comprehend sits with ease in the real world. It is almost nothing. Now he is carrion, stitched forever in the cramp of a trial. No one can evict us from books, he used to say, running through astonishment at full speed. These next two poems share the same title, Certainty. Edward Taylor was a frontier minister who wrote a prolific amount of devotional poetry. The poems are full of deep piety, learned and quiet, but sometimes an errant wildness runs under the seams of his words. It's said that he wrote poetic meditations to put himself in the correct spiritual state for his communion with Christ. I imagine the task swallowing him each time, moving its own patient way like snowmelt. A poem may hold the unwieldy pieces of the earth together with a whole heart. A poem may cut that heart to lace. His first wife, Elizabeth Fitch, bore 8 children. 5 died in infancy. Taylor wrote more and more sermons and poems. Sometimes a conceit makes itself necessary in the safety of the impasse between word and world. And make my soul thy holy spool to be, writes Taylor. His parishioners were called to worship in the wilderness with the beat of a drum, amid cold plants, the night coming on, undelivered ashes of stars. Flocks take to the sky at dusk, and I have wondered if the parishioners counted the days. As in, did they ever travel past the corrective of the afterworld to stand in the strong spine of rivers? According to Taylor, in heaven soaring up, I dropped an ear on earth, and oh, sweet melody. Or weren't there deranged cries in the wilderness too? Taylor's trust appears both adamantine and vulnerable, like the slow plan of the flowering grass or torn, stilled clouds. Alone in his study, he writes down some dimensions. I'm but a flesh and blood bag, oh. Consider the strange and riotous interior through which so many nameless things fly. As weeds continue to idle their tails, leaves molder right on time. In the rafters of the sky, a pristine star shines with unassailability. It can't be taught a thing. The wilderness, I cannot get around the back of it. And again, certainty. Perhaps you can tell children that the world is always a more beautiful place than you can suppose. And then you release them into their future, the black row of trees in the distance. She died suddenly in midwinter, in the same bed in which her husband died years earlier. It still sagged on his side. Her second husband remained in Japan with his first family. She used to say, "What my 3 girls do when they are on their own is unimaginable to me." My mother is the middle daughter, a garden of inaudible tunes. The 4 of them lived in a mean house in Seoul. One yellowing picture of my grandmother remains, and her face turns away from the camera as the rabbit senses the hound. She was said to be a solitary eater, an inner thing. What did she promise the world that she wasn't able to make good on? A child who abruptly feels the frontiers of experience assert themselves in her. At the funeral, my mother cries so hard she can't feel her hands for days. It explains how she scratches herself raw, meaningless. And you have always believed these are your themes: fate, the negative pleasures of dipping oneself in acid. You think it will rescue you from your simplicity, remarks my mother from the doorway. But art is never the ace in the hole. I am not a stupid child. I'm not even a child any longer, with her hesitant, then terrible certainty that loss is tragic, not only pointless. When she is lonely, my mother cooks, and when she is happy, she knows to hide it. The next few poems I'm going to read, they're very short poems, and in these poems I can say I wanted to look at inwardness or interiority with a somewhat dispassionate eye, to kind of resist reaching toward any kind of grand synthesis. And so I wanted to just see, part of the experiment of the poems was to see what could come up from this kind of cold looking, I guess. That was the hope anyway. This poem is called Wildlife. I can see drafty stars drift inside my skull. Roots and boles and boughs and leaves press at the backs of my eyes. A spider rambles inside my body and scuttles out of my mouth. This suit is an agony. Black flies from the creek fall into my teacup. Keep one eye on the world, they say. Wintering. The stars gave up their deep drifting and touched bottom. No clouds toppled across the snow wilderness. No gloom dark tree glitter winding and twining its silks. Blankness, egg quiet. The level sprawl of the world drew away tinily in every direction. Afternoons remained unknown to each other. Yet loss keeps thudding past my house, telling me I'm not done. My heart's still leaping like rats. Hyperballad. I think my interior, it must be a killing machine. I ask it what the shooting means. I am trying to think. I let it look right through me, having no choice in the matter. It's no space and it's no time. They bring me to my knees. It straps me to my body as if I were made for it. It begins its waist with a slight forward pull. I help it with its loneliness, but I avert my eyes. I know that it will always be a good part of me. As it continues its arrivals, I will not say I'm shot. As it burns all over, I'll know I'm not erased. They say with mystery all things are possible, somewhere in the huge whisper of the coldest oceans. Sweet water brims through the winter ices. O philosopher of destructions, nevertheless my heart is pounding. Remarks on my sculpture. In 1973, I found myself engaged in a sort of assemblage of odd pieces of organic material connected in a series. I asked the questions, what is a subject? What are the isolations around what something is? The shapes and dimensions of my figures, its volumes of air and light and dew, had a fraught and transient quality. I used string and wire, the scent of snow and winter dawn, fanaticism. I hated less than the wholeness of a situation. Hunger is a conventional metaphor for desire, and here I use it simply. It is just what the hand does, where the eye leads. The absent senses of a word on a starless night, implied and precluded, mediate the tone of a condition. Not instances of a geometry or some other larger order, more or less thinkable. It is paid for by existence. And I think I'll close with the first and last poems in the book. What I can say about them is it's always interesting to look back at the poems. I often write poems to see what I'm thinking about something. I think for these two poems that open and close the book, they, in some part, narrate how maybe conditions or feelings of fear or frailty, tenderness, can quickly change into feelings of rage, actually, or a kind of turbulent energy, if nothing else. Small container, fury. Rembrandt paints his carcass of beef. You see a little blood near the poppies and don't think of detachment. Humbert and his girl are driving across America. One has a thirst so unslakable, one walks right into the river. How exciting spring is, and how errant, holding out love and death like a platter of the daintiest cakes. As I do my work, I think, let me topple, wear thin. Let the world eat me, but then let the world sob, not me. And this last poem is called Cliffs. Words are afraid up here, the rapture and the terrifying exposure. Strange birds roosting, a human voice shouting a world's end shout. Snow hurries to the meeting, wanting to cover the waking in my body. I could fill up the sea with this waking. The outlook is thrilling. It satisfies. It goes even further than the view from the heights of love. It eats the roof off the sky. Thank you very much.
I'm going to read about a dozen poems from Termy Luce, The Unghosting of Medgar Evers. I'm going to assume you all know who Medgar Evers is, so I won't do a huge or long intro. But it's worth knowing that these poems are all in the voices of other people, specifically the killer, Byron Daley Beckwith, his wife, Thelma, her voice, and the voice of Merle Evers. And there's at least one or two poems that I'll read that are meant to be in the voice of history, to fill in the blank for those of you who don't know the story. And I'll dedicate this to for some reason, all of my students who are in this room, former students and current, all the way from Kentucky, which is kind of scary to me. But spring break. This first poem is Byron de Lebecq, the assassin, speaking. And if you don't know the story, he had 3 different trials, and he was found guilty in the 3rd trial. And part of what was used to convince the jury this 3rd time that he was guilty was this often used quote from speeches he gave when he was presenting before the Ku Klux Klan. An undercover FBI agent who pretended to be a member of the Klan testified that de Lebecq said that killing Medgar was no more difficult than the pain women endure when they give birth to children. And for me, that quote just really, as a parent, I mean, it just kind of shifted my psyche, because I thought about, what it took to compare taking a life to bringing life into the world. That he recognized the power of that moment, but he saw it totally different from the way I would, the way I think most people would. So this first poem is in his voice, and it's called Afterbirth, Byron de Lebecq. Like them, a man can conceive an idea, an event, a moment so clearly he can name it even before it breathes. We both can carry a thing around inside for only so long, and no matter how small it starts out, it can swell and get so heavy our backs hurt and we can't find comfort enough to sleep at night. All we can think about is the relief that waits at the end. When it was finally time, it was painless. It was the most natural thing I'd ever done. I just closed my eyes and squeezed, then opened them, and there he was, just laying there, still covered with blood, but already trying to crawl. I must admit, like any proud parent, I was afraid at first, afraid he'd live, afraid he'd die too soon. Funny how life and death is a whole lot of pushing and pulling, holding and seeking breath, a whole world turned upside down until somebody screams. So hopefully you can feel that particular tone and darkness that he fills up in this space. One of the things that was difficult during the research is trying to figure out to what degree his wives, his first and second wife, were complicit with his activity. If you look at all the footage of the trials, they were always, through the 3 trials, you could look over his shoulder and there was a wife sitting right behind them, and you could almost see this fierce loyalty that she represented. And he admitted to being a monster. He bragged about it, but I couldn't figure out if it made her a monster by default. But the fact that she divorced him and then left him a second time meant that there was a line in the sand that she wouldn't cross. So this is called Fireproof, and this is Willie de Lebecq. He would come home from evening rallies and secret meetings, so in love with me, I could never see nothing wrong with what he did with his hands. I just pretended I didn't know what gunpowder smelled like, or why he kept his rifles so clean. If he walked through that door and said, "Willie, burn these clothes," I'd pile them on the coals and stare at the fire. I'd listen to the music twixt the crackle and calm as we danced. And while the ashes gathered round their own kind in the bottom of the grate, I'd watch the embers glow like our bedroom did. Now, I ain't saying he was right or wrong. He often confused hatred with desire. But if you ain't never set a man on fire, felt him explode inside you, then die in your arms, honey, you got no idea what I'm talking about. One of the things I wanted to do in this collection is to put the voices, the temperature of the voices together, so you'll get a sense of a conversation all the way through the book. Immediately after this particular poem is a poem by Merle Evers, the widow of Medgar. And she also references being in a bedroom with her husband and listening to music. And you can imagine that they both love their husbands maybe the same way, maybe differently, but it manifests in a totally different energy. This is called Listening to Music, Merle Evers. The right song dancing through the air at the end of a long day full of kids and no husband could not only set the tone, but put the sound of yesterday back in the air. Smokey Robinson and the Miracles crooned all the sweet words that his eyes whispered across the door frame when he finally came home. But more often than not, it was Sam Cooke and Ray Charles or Bobby Blue Bland taking turns in my ears, reminding me how much I love that man, no matter how mad or lonely I might have felt. The right song was like a Kodak brownie of us cuddling, or an atlas mapping out all of our rough spots and the ways around them. After sweet-talking him out of his suit and tie, after he unloaded the day's burdens, we melted together in the dark beneath the covers and the crackle of the radio, the sound of my guys singing backup and Medgar's jackhammer heart finally slowing to match our leaky faucet, as he fell asleep in my arms, completing the soundtrack for a perfect night. This next poem is, I always say it's special to me, but it's really probably the scariest poem in the collection because of what happened with the poem. I found out after the book was finished that when Medgar was shot, Merle Evers was pregnant, and the power of all that and the experience made her have a miscarriage, and the poem will speak for itself. It's called When Death Moved In. Merle Evers. When death moved in, it attached itself to our lives, first like an unplanned pregnancy, then like our fourth child. We didn't talk about its disfigured face or its crooked limbs and spine. We went about the people's business, tried to pretend that it wasn't really there, though some nights it filled up every open space in the room, often crawling into bed between us, making it difficult to sleep. Every new registered voter, successful boycott, demonstration, and primetime television minute put fat on its face. Images of Medgar escorting James Meredith into Ole Miss were celebrated with new front teeth. When it crawled to the front door and spoke its first cuss words, it sounded like a car backfired twice. One of the things I tried to imagine is what would the women say to each other if they met? So this is a poem called Sorority Meeting that imagines Merle Evers is speaking directly to Willie and Thelma De La Beckwith. My faith urges me to love you. My stomach begs me to not. All I know is that day made us sisters somehow. After long, nervous nights and trials on end, we are bound together in this unholy sorority of misery. I think about you every time I run my hands across the echoes and the hollows of my sheets. They seem loudest just before I wake. I open my eyes every morning, half expecting Medgar to be there. Then I think about you, and your eyes always snatch me back. Your eyes won't let me forget. We are sorority sisters now, with a gut-wrenching country ballad for a sweetheart song, tired funeral and courtroom clothes for colors and secrets we would take to our graves. I was forced to sleep night after night after night with the ghost. You chose to sleep with the killer. We all pledged our love, crossed our hearts, and swallowed oaths before being initiated with a bullet. This next poem is in the imagined voice of the bullet, and the details are taken directly from the court transcripts that describe the path the bullet traveled after it left Medgar's body. Beckwith was across the street in some honeysuckle bushes, hiding, and used a high-powered rifle and scope to shoot him in his own driveway. His kids were in the house. And the title comes from how much the scrap of bullet weighed. It's called 1/3 of 180 grams of lead, the bullet. Both of them were history, even before one pulled the trigger, before I rocketed through the smoking barrel hidden in the honeysuckle, before I tore through a man's back, shattered his family, a window, and tore through an inner wall, before I bounced off a refrigerator and a coffee pot, before I landed at my destined point in history next to a watermelon. What was cruel was the irony, not the melon, not the man falling in slow motion, but the man squinting through the crosshairs, reducing the justice system to a small circle, praying that he not miss, then sending me to deliver a message as if the woman screaming in the dark or the children crying at her feet could ever believe a bullet was small enough to hate. All right. And I know those poems weren't the warmest, but they were about the truth and our history. I'll read a couple more, and two of these are as funny as the book gets. So if you need some humor, you might find some levity in this next poem, called One Mississippi, Two Mississippis. Some of us learn a counting game when we were young with that title. You got old plantations. We got shotgun houses. You got sprawling verandas. We got a piece of front porch. You got beautiful gardens. We got cotton fields. You got Ole Miss Law School. We got Parchman Prison. You got Gulf Shore beaches. We got riverbanks. You got debutante balls. We got juke joints. You got bridge parties. We got dominoes and spades. You got mint juleps. We got homemade hooch. You got your grandmother's china. We got paper plates. You see a proud history. We see a racist past. You don't remember lynchings. We can't forget. You got blacks. We got the blues. I did say humor, but maybe I should say dark humor, right? This next one tries to imagine, Medgar Evers is trying to imagine what it would be like if the killer on his deathbed, in the Southern tradition of forgiveness, received the Lord and was able to enter into heaven. But on arriving and discovering that God doesn't look like the God he imagined, he thinks he's gone to hell instead. So this is called Last Meal Haiku, Medgar Evers. Imagine Byron sitting down to eat, using his cotton shirt sleeves as substitutes for napkins, clutching a steak knife, no unleavened bread, enjoying blood that drips from every single bite of his final meal. Imagine before he lays down to sleep, ready to meet his maker, he gets on his knees and confesses all his sins in time to be saved. But when he looks up at God's burnt brass face, he thinks he has gone to hell. All right, me and one other person think that's funny. All right, three of us. I'll close with this poem called Heavyweight. It's really kind of the moral lesson in this entire conversation. We know that issues around race are still the most difficult conversations in America. And one of the things that we're still struggling with, especially in the South, is this idea of what forgiveness looks like. How do you pass all that if you refuse to talk about it, But part of what we've learned from reconciliation is first acknowledging it, face to face, the victim and the perpetrator, and then moving past it. So this is called Heavyweight, W-A-I-T. If Mississippi is to love her elephant self, she needs a memory as sharp as her ivory tusk, with as many wrinkles as her thick, thick past. If she forgets, she needs only to reach back, caress her keloid skin, and run her fingers across the braille history raised on her spine or the bruised couplets around her supple neck. For Mississippi to love her elephant self, she needs only to open her blue-gray eyes and move, move as if she carries the entire weight of history and Southern guilt on her massive head, move in any direction as long as it is forward. For Mississippi to love her elephant self, she must ask for, extend, and receive forgiveness. But she must never, ever, ever forget. Thank you.
So thank you both for your readings. It was, it's really interesting to hear you guys read together because I feel like you have such different aesthetics. But to me, you're still like raising a lot of the same questions in my mind, just coming from them in radically different ways. And so I was thinking maybe we can start off the discussion just by having you both briefly kind of touch on the bibliographies that you're bringing to this conversation and to your work at large, like what your influences are and who you see yourself in conversation with, and what those influences have been, how they've affected you and your work at the moment.
I mean, just in terms of like poetic.
No, anything.
Oh, anything.
Yeah. It's all important, right? It all goes into the work.
Yeah. In terms of, I mean, I actually started writing poems in college, so I think, and I was a big reader, like I'm sure many writers are. So, in fact, I was very taken and thought I would be a fiction writer. So I read a lot of fiction, prose, and then sort of discovered poetry in college through, I always say it's through a clerical error that I ended up in a reading and writing poetry class. And in that class, and since the poets I often return to when I'm stuck or I'm just wanting inspiration, I mean, it's very, like there's Rilke, Sappho, T.S. Eliot, Anne Carson, Stevens, you know, it's very wide-ranging. But one thing that my students found interesting, they said, they read an interview, often when I'm actually writing poetry, it's hard for me to be reading very actively other poems or other poets because I am afraid of imitating too closely. But that's when I'm sort of hard into the writing of something. So I'll tend to read prose again in that situation. And in that case, I feel drawn lately to, or often historically, but lately to short stories. Maybe there's something about the short story that seems very close to poetry.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think that, I don't think of myself as a poet as much as a writer who also speaks that language that's poetry. I'm actually trained as a fiction writer. I'm just a lot slower at writing fiction. And but when I think about my, the major influences, they come from the traditional space. Being an English major with degrees in English, there's everybody in the canon that I felt like I had to read. Many of them I haven't read since, grabbing that piece of paper and jumping off the stage. But if I could have built my own, curriculum and, it would have started with a Lucille Clifton. And Gwendolyn Brooks, and then I think about the broader aesthetics of somebody like a James Baldwin, because I'm not simply interested in the form it takes on the page. I'm really interested in what happens with the work and its engagement with the community. I think of now I'm one of those crazy writers who think of their activity as art activism. I'm not really trying to make something beautiful. I think there's enough beauty in the world. So I really need my work to do something, to move something, to not scream and yell, but to challenge. And so I look for those examples in the real world, and I don't know if anybody did it the way Baldwin did in his era. And then you think about, how do you do it in a real space during your real life? I think Lucille Clifton is the best example of that. She talks about how the reason her poems are so short, she was raising kids. And as a parent, that's real to me. And I talk to my students a lot about, not having to go somewhere and be by yourself and try to create poetry that's separate from living. that to find a way to let poetry also be about living, and that your life and the poetry find that kind of balance, so that you understand it's important, but you don't think you have to be a magician to make it happen. I think that's really important. But I also like reading my students' work. There are 3 wonderful young poets in the room whose work I admire already, and a lot of colleagues around the room who write amazing stuff. But I think, because at heart I think of myself as a teacher, then a writer, I think it's almost natural that I'm moved by my students' work. So whatever they're writing right now that I'm grading, I'm reading and having to think about.
Before I move on to the next question, I just want to say if throughout this you guys have questions for each other, definitely jump in. Or if you want to turn a question over to the audience, whether a particular person or the audience at large, I think that's great too. We don't have to posit that at the end. I think it can be an exchange if you'd like. But Frank, what you just said about wanting your work to present a challenge made me think of another connection that I saw through you all's work, which is you're both kind of interested in the idea of the unconscious. And Frank, for you, it was really apparent in your dream sequence, by which the reader kind of sees the motivations behind, or the fear that motivates the actions of Byron and Willie. And then I think, Sandra, a lot of the wilderness is kind of thinking around the idea that we operate at multiple levels of consciousness, and kind of a desire to remain legible, but also, which is at tension with our desire to access something beyond. And the question that it formed for me is more of a process question for you both, which is, how do you, as you're writing and thinking of yourself as a historical being and a political being, how do you write and leaving space to question yourself, and maintaining space to kind of root out maybe the investment in historical narratives or institutional apparatuses that are a product in your own mind?
Let me chew on that question for a moment. That's a big one.
Okay.
Yeah, that is a big question. In terms of, I'm very interested in dreams, and I often think, actually, when I'm writing poems, as it being something kind of in the middle of conscious and unconscious states, I guess. And whether it's through, like Frank, as in your poems, I was so interested in the poems that you were reading, where it's amazing to me in poems that we can, like you're speaking, and these voices are sort of speaking through you to this audience right now in 2015. Like, there's just a magic element to that. So for me, the unconscious and the dreams, that transference over onto the page and then into the ears of listeners is extremely, there's a kind of element of magic to it in a way. The hard part, I guess, is once it's down on the page, it's sort of that tinkering, is this translating, or has something gotten lost in its way out? And so, as I said in my reading too, sometimes I'm figuring out I'm figuring out what I'm saying, or what my story is, or the unconscious narrative is, after it's sort of there on the page already. And then it's just carrying it around the apartment, revising from less crummy, or crummy to less crummy states. I think, is that answering part I know there was a second part of the question.
I think that the second part of the question is kind of, are there strategies that you have to kind of write beyond yourself, or in spite of yourself? Recognizing that there's more to us than we're conscious of. How do you try to get beyond that?
Oh, yes. Actually, although I didn't read specifically from this section in my book, there's a whole long poem that is about Anne Bradstreet. And actually, I read a poem about Edward Taylor, and it wasn't a conscious decision to write about someone other than myself, maybe. But when I look back, I think, well, there are early American poets. I was interested in them. I thought, why am I interested in them? What's close to me in some respect is I thought I was interested in their emotional states, their intellectual states as basically immigrants to this country. So I think that was a way into it. I like doing some research, but it just even imagining my way into their states of mind. But really, it's still imagining a way into my own interiority still. It would that kind of enlarged the space, I think. So there's a worry or anxiety I have always too, that I'm only writing about myself or my subjectivity. I'm a little less worried now. I think it's just a function of aging too. So I'm not as worried.
Well, it's a big question. I'll speak to the space of dreams. For me, when I write and I use dreams, particularly in the extended narratives that are around historical conversations and stories, it's really important for me to try to create these really round, real, authentic characters. And what I've found is that if the characters are allowed to speak through their dreams, that I'm able to share another level of their subconscious or even their psychological state that kind of shows them, and it's like peeling off your brain and looking inside. You get this kind of sneak peek at how these people really are and what motivates them. I found that to be successful, and I really needed it with this last collection because I found I had a hard time understanding, what would make a man feel comfortable wanting to kill another man simply because he was a different color. Was it just that? And trying to really deconstruct the core of racism, and what is that anger? What is the violence? Where does it come from? Is it a mental illness? Is it just so careless? Is it the devaluing of the human life? What is it? And I think those dreams and what he thinks about in those dream states really kind of reveals who he is at the core. And that's what I'm hoping to accomplish. But that comes out of a space because I think that dreams are really important. I think we think we understand what they are because we can measure them and do sleep studies and understand what levels of sleep there are. But I'm not convinced that we don't go to another dimension in what we call sleep and travel back and forth, and we just call it dreaming and waking. I often feel my mother's been gone for over 10 years now, but whenever I dream about her, I feel like she visited me on purpose, that she needed to say something, or I needed her, and she always shows up. And then when my siblings hear about it, they want to know every single detail. They want to know what she looked like, how she was doing, as if she physically came into the room and sat down. And it still has that kind of presence because the dreams are so visual. So I respect dreams because we don't understand them, and that gives us room to decide what they really are and how they can move. And I really believe that the writing process doesn't start when you sit down and put a pen to the page or fingers to the keyboard. That if you're really paying attention in the world, that even when you're dreaming, you're involved in the writing process because you can write down those dreams, right? So I think it's important to thank you for recognizing that was a key element in this collection and some others. But dreaming, I'm still trying to figure it out. I'm waiting to try to create the sci-fi poetry collection would be the next attempt to really explore this dream thing. But some of you look like I'm making you feel uncomfortable, so I'll stop there.
Both of you have mentioned research, and I believe that with all the persona poems, you must have done a great bit for this book. And it's making me think of a question that I wasn't sure I would bring up. I was out of town over the weekend without internet, and I came back to find out about the Kenny Goldsmith reading at Brown. Are you guys aware of that yet? Okay. Kenneth Goldsmith gave a reading at Brown this weekend where he kind of rearranged the autopsy, of Mike Brown, and rehearsed it in front of a picture of Mike Brown. And there's been, of course, a lot of backlash against it. And having found out about it this morning, I wasn't sure what to say about it yet. My initial reaction is, of course, just anger. But I think that just this idea of telling other people's stories or telling stories that aren't your own, and what you have to do with the material, or how to approach that idea of going into someone else's life. And I'm not asking you to kind of prescribe when you can and when you can't, or who can and who can't, but if one wants to, what are some suggestions you have for taking that material and doing something new with it? I know, Frank, with your personas, yes, there's a lot of research, but you've also found a way to kind of comment on the lives of the people rather than simply convey material that you've found. And so I'm wondering if you have any other suggestions for writers who want to use found material in their work.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the first thing easily is to do the research, to talk to people, to find as many kinds of ways to get to that space, or to those individuals, to hear their voices. When I did the Lewis and Clark books, I spent 3 summers traveling to the Northwest, retracing the Lewis and Clark Trail. We spent a month on the Nez Perce Reservation. We watched movies and listened to music, read books. I went to a Lewis and Clark reenactors conference, and it was just the strangest space. No offense to a Lewis and Clark fan in here, but to be in a room with 1,000 people, mostly male, over 60, retired, half of them dressed up as Lewis or Clark, but really gung-ho about it. It was like a Comic-Con for Lewis and Clark. It was a really strange space for me, and I was the only black person in the room. And I was probably the youngest person in the room, so I was really in this altered space. But it was interesting just being in that space to see how committed they were. They talked about what they did every year. I mean, they celebrated Lewis and Clark birthdays, and they read the journals over and over again. They visited the same places. They camped out. They traveled and retraced their trail year-round. So to be in the same place on the same day, that's commitment, and I really wanted to respect that. At the same time, I also knew that when I read from that collection, that they would be at the edge of their seats waiting for me to get it wrong. And in fact, I always think about, reading that ballroom to 1,000 people, and I get to the end of the poems and I say, thank you, and I stop, and I leave the platform and go down to my seat at the table, and I sit, and nothing has happened. I mean, not even and they're looking around the room waiting to check in to see, did they get it right? And then somebody said, and then they started clapping, and then it turned into a bigger ovation. But it was that strange gap between, being in somebody else's space. I think that for me, because I'm a fiction person, I don't think I need permission to tell somebody else's story. That's what fiction writers do. And nobody asks fiction writers that question. But if you're a poet and you tell somebody else's story, people want to know what gives you the authority to speak from somebody else's voice. I don't even respond to the question. But at the same time, I think that if you're going to do it, to respect authenticity, that's the goal. Not necessarily the truth, but people need to believe it. They don't need to know what the facts are, because you're limited to the facts anyway. And then once you exhaust yourself of the facts, then you can use your imagination, your poetic energy, and make sure that your craft comes to the table and your imagination comes to the table. Because to write those poems, or any poem, I think you just need memory, research, and imagination. And whatever combination you need to create every poem, that's what you bring to the table. And more research than anything if you're doing historical pieces, because if you get it wrong, somebody would tell you.
I think too, I hesitate to say to other people, or to my students or to myself, oh, I can't write about X, or I can't write from such and such kind of subjectivity. It seems very limiting. There are other problems with it. And one of the reasons I like writing poems, or I think one of the reasons I write poems at all, is I enjoy being in that state of kind of doubt and being somewhat uncomfortable and being in a state where I'm not decided yet. So in terms of kind of speaking for another or speaking from the subject position of another, I mean, in my book, I'm in conversation, one of the poems, with Bradstreet, who of course, and the title of the poem is, that I use in my book, is Homage to Mistress Bradstreet. So I'm entering already an ongoing conversation between Berryman and Bradstreet, for instance. Or I'm speaking through the voice of my uncle, for instance, who, in terms of research, I actually only met when I was a young child. But I think subjectivity is so essentially strange and peculiar and wild that I feel I have permission, in a way, to go ahead and enter and do what I need to do to find out what the poem wants to say, or what I want to figure out in taking on a different voice. Of course, one has to be responsible. I agree in terms of research. I think of it more in terms of not necessarily, I mean, of course one wants to get the facts straight, but also I always feel like I'm trying to make sure I'm getting the atmosphere or the sensibility kind of right. So in that, and somehow something about that to me is keeping the poem honest, or it's giving the poem or the voice a kind of integrity.
Okay, we're going to switch gears a little bit. There's a lot of attention to, I think, musicality in your book, Frank, and I feel strange saying that because I know you said you don't think about making something that's beautiful, but in terms of like your section titles and your poem titles and a lot of the epigraphs coming from musicians and singers, and then Sandra, in your book, I feel like there's, or in The Wilderness specifically, I feel like there is this really precise attention to language and to word choice and to rhythms that creates this oscillation between like feeling and thought that I experience really musically. And so I was wondering if you guys could talk about your relationship to music and sonic experiences when you're writing.
I think for me, in writing, in these particular poems, thank you, I like that idea between feeling and thought you said, and that you can see that musically. A lot of times when I'm interested, again, in writing poems in general, is the different kinds of sense that is arrived at. Not just, of course, through information, language information, but through music, I suppose. So for me, in writing the poems, I think sometimes I wasn't super conscious of it as a necessarily musical thing, but just in getting the sounds right. Like it would be like rhythms. Some of the poems are written, I said, in sort of prose-like rhythms. They're end-stopped, they're long sentences in a way, and those were the poems that were actually giving me a lot of problems, I think. But I think it was because the thinking was difficult in them. I was trying to figure out what the poem was trying to say. So it felt inextricable, the sound and the sense of it, I guess. So there's no way in which, or not yet anyway, that when I'm writing a poem or when I wrote these poems, there was a sort of separate like sound element and then grafting on the language, like a score necessarily. But But I'm sure I tell my students all the time too, when they're writing poems, to read their poems aloud. Listen, and what are you getting from that? Do you want to listen to it again? Do you want to read it again? So I think for me, the music comes into it mainly in that it's a different kind of sense making that poetry makes available. What do you think?
Yeah, I would definitely echo that. In addition to the music inside the individual poems, at least for the mega collection, I was very intentional about the architecture of this book, so much so that I wanted to create a conversation between two songs, Dixie and Strange Fruit. And if you know those songs and you know the words, there are section titles all the way through the book that are borrowed from those two songs, so that it kind of replicates this conversation. And one song conjures up a kind of melancholy and sense of horror that is part of our history. The other, depending on who's singing it, it's a happy song, but sometimes, and it's also, it's a happy song if it's a fraternity party, but it's it's the exact opposite if it's at a lynching. Right? And it's the same song being sung. I think so. It's amazing that that song could be in different spaces and have different meaning. So I wanted to borrow from all of that, because I think those two songs really characterize this duality in the South and with our history. The Old South, the New South, the blue and the gray, this whole counter-argument about, what do we do with racism? And I really want to extend this idea of a conversation and to do it musically. There are probably a dozen poems in the book that reference music specifically, that allow the conversation about the importance of folk songs and gospel music in the tradition, in the civil rights era, and even the idea of imagine the sound of a bell. There's a poem that deals with rape, but talks about it in terms of thinking about what a bell sounds like, and what it sounds like when it's not ringing, and then using ringing, as in wringing your hands, to extend that idea of how to extend this idea of what, of how you can move a metaphor, but at the same time still talk about music and then use it musically at the same time. So it was very important for me to break that down so that I can use it for students. This is one of the books that I use. I think it's the first time I used one of my own books in the classroom, but I like using it because, I know all about it, and I can really teach the kids about intentionality and the architecture of how to structure a book in a way that extends the meaning beyond individual poems. And I'm sure they got all of that, still in the room here. But yeah, I think the music is important. If you don't, I go to the page expecting to get some music, and I'm listening to the tone. And then when the reader reads their own poem, you get another layer of music. Get a kind of, like the lyrical beauty of your own voice. I was kind of floating and thinking that, I don't have anything that beautiful. That's nice. I can listen to this for a while. So that, I think it's an oral tradition. People, and part of keeping people's interest. If you're not using rhyme, it's still using music and paying attention to meter and pace. Last night was about delivery, but to do it in a way that people feel like they got something in that finished piece, that they listened to a song, a performance, and it was musical. It was worth listening to.
Poetry is an oral tradition, and I'm really interested in kind of the concerns that arise for me when we translate it into material. When something that's an oral tradition becomes something that's like primarily seen in books. At least in academic institutions, poetry is usually experienced through books. And that reminds me of one of your poems, Selva Attica, I think. It's a poem toward the end. There's this attention to the conflation between a white page and blankness, that we kind of have to take for granted if we want to read. There's this idea that a white page is a blank space, and in fact, a white page is pigmented. It is theoretical frame. It is always already loaded with meaning. And so I was wondering if you could talk some about that, about kind of the materiality of language and kind of how that reflects things that are assumptions that we operate within in the larger world.
I think in terms of the oral, maybe the oral or and aural, A-U-R-A-L, versus visual, I do, as much as I like to read my poems aloud as I'm writing them, I also do write, I think, for the page or visually. So I don't think of, I always feel myself as working with the white space, that it is, in fact, that substrate is concrete material. I think, especially when you're looking at it visually, you know, how are the lines, you know, are they going across the page? It's interesting, too, when it comes to issues of publication. I got so used to seeing certain poems as they were in my Word document. And then when it came back in proofs, oh, it was like a terrible violence had happened. And I really had to, you know, it was interesting to consider those issues, and and they were sort of like basic issues 101. I was like, is this the same poem? If this changed? And these were, again, those lines that were sort of sentence-like lines. So they didn't have specific line breaks, but the look of it was so different to me that it was very hard to grapple with in the beginning. And I thought, could we make the pages bigger? And they said, of course not, you know. So different things had to be done. But I think a lot, especially for things that I'm writing now or thinking about writing now, about the material nature of language. In teaching, too, I think it comes up a lot, especially because in beginning workshops, my students are so in that mode of, students who've never maybe read much poetry, in sort of code-breaking mode. So, you know, what is the key that will unlock the meaning? And then if I know the meaning, why did they write it this way in the first place? So this thing where, but isn't it interesting that this writer used this particular word, and besides the connotations, denotations, the look of the word, the history of the word, that's the fun part for me, actually. So it seems, again, inextricably linked with whatever I'm trying to say in a given poem. The language that's used, it's even in English, it's often like a foreign language, or like material, like clay or something, or paint, in a lot of ways. So I think that's where I'm coming at it.
I have nothing to add to that. You bring it all by itself.
How are we on time? Should we? 5:20. So we switch it over to questions? Yeah. Are there questions from? Oh, yes. Right here. Oh, okay.
Oh.
I'm just reminded that whenever I look at the postcards of the lynchings that was sold and sent around and kept in families, you would see the lynched body sometimes charred, but those who posed were smiling. They're always smiling. So when you say about the happy songs, I would imagine that maybe there was happy songs.
I think maybe.
This also isn't a question. Sandra, I just wanted to comment on how much I love the leaps. You talked about connecting the stanzas or the thoughts, and Frank referenced a lecture that Adrian Matika gave last night on pacing, and some of the elements he talked about were an event advancing the poem, wordplay, image, and that in some ways analogous to the actual almost physical comedy or linguistic comedy that stand-ups we use. So there's a translation. It's not the same. It's not the same things that we're using or strategies, but the equivalency. And that's, I loved what I considered now I'm thinking in terms of pacing, how you create that expectation. And especially since you were talking about the dreamlike state, or, like this bardo space, I think that works so successfully in your poems, because I'm not sure exactly where I'm positioned or where the speaker's positioned. And I love that kind of mystery or exploration or question, or, as you say, doubt. And I think it comes across so beautifully in the technique that you're using. So I just wanted to say thanks.
Thank
for
you.
that.
Definitely agree with that.
That was
Second
long-winded,
that.
sorry.
Thank you very much.
Others?
Hi, thank you so much. This was really lovely tonight. And this might build a bit on the question earlier about persona and subjectivity and inhabiting spaces that might supposedly not be ours in terms of the exploration of persona poems and just writing from different places. I was wondering, can you talk a little bit about the aestheticization of violence or the aestheticization of oppression? Because like when I think about like a lot of the work that I do and a lot of other writers that I respect, there's so many different ways in which our work can be co-opted and used against our communities in a variety of ways. And also, I feel there is sometimes a danger in whether we talk about as beauty or we talk about as craft, like what does it mean to render something as a fine work of art that is about something that's really either in the historical period or in the contemporary period or imagined space, speculative space, something that's really horrible. And so just to think a little bit, like, how do you craft your work and thinking about those moments in which, is this too beautiful? Is this something that I need to reconsider the interiority of this character in a persona poem or something? Like, how do you balance those kinds of moments as you're crafting your work, or how do you think about it all?
Well, I think for me, it's when I said earlier that I'm not trying to make something beautiful, like I would be horrified if I romanticized something that was horrible, I mean, I don't, or if an editor, well, actually this happened, an editor asked me to take some of the poems that appear in the final version of Terminus. It was at a different press, and they decided they would not publish it because there were at least a half a dozen poems that they thought were offensive, that brought up topics that she would rather people not talk about or think about or be associated with them, the book and the press. And if I didn't take those poems out, they would not publish it. So it was an easy decision for me. I mean, it hurt, but I knew immediately that I didn't want to take the poems out because it would change, what I thought I had built. And two, that, I need to find another press. But I think it's important that, that we respect history, that we honor it also, that we honor the truth. And I think it also means it's hard for some people because it's, most people don't want to be uncomfortable. And I remember the first time I read the rough draft of these poems, and I read only in the voice of the assassin for about 15 minutes. And then I looked up, and everybody in the audience was wiped out. I mean, they were in tears and sobbing, and part of that was, was horror, part of it was guilt, part of it was the discomfort of being reminded of that truth. And I have to think about, that made me think about the structure of the book, because I didn't want to create a book that people would pick up, read 3 pages, and then put down because it was too dark, it was too painful. How do I create a conversation that will allow people to kind of dip in something difficult, then kind of back up and, move through it in a way that at the end of the book, it was worth it. But I didn't cheat, that it's still about the truth. You don't want, there will not be a musical based on this book. Right? There's no happy song and dance with the assassin, man. And if that happened, that would be more horrible than anything. So I think for me, I don't think I spend a lot of time thinking about those kinds of things. I'm just thinking about telling the truth. And I'm really attracted to stories that aren't being told, or that have been misrepresented or undertold, or people have been left out. And that's an easy space for me to be in. I'm most comfortable there, in fact.
I think the only thing I would add to that is sometimes in certain poems I'll try to make perhaps the question of it, the romanticization or aestheticization, like self-reflexive in the work, or that becomes maybe part of the poem. And then just another sort of maybe litmus test sometimes that when you're reading draft is, am I making this, is it, as Frank was saying, like sort of an honest foray into the subjectivity, into the story, into the situation, the condition, or is it again, it just ends up being another spectacle, and that, which, can make the reader, the listener, passive and just, and usually I feel like in that case too, people are uncomfortable when there's something unexpected or nuanced, whereas if it's like a spectacle, it's expected, the message, it's something that you already know, or it's a cliche in some way, or done for some kind of perverse pleasure, it probably isn't very much alive as a poem anyway. So I think something about maybe sometimes being self-reflexive in the work, whether through the language or through tone or through formal structures, that is a way, I think, out of that kind of romanticization or aestheticization, if I'm understanding.
I want to invite you guys to buy books and join us for a reception. Let's give another hand clap to our poets, Sandra Lim, Frank X. Walker, and Saretta Morgan. Thank you again to the New School for having us. Let's mix and mingle.
Thank you.
Please sign this for both of you.
Thank you, and I want to
Thank
give you
you.
a book. Thank you so much.